time for the project For Future, combining threat intelligence and attack simulation with Staffan, Truvé at RecordedFuture. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And Simin did a great job of doing parts of my presentation, so I can actually spend some time on other parts. See where we are. All these slides. So I'll tell the rest of the story about Forseti, which Simin didn't tell. So this is a Vinnova-funded project. The partners originally were us, KTH, Swedavia as a use case, and Forseti, spin-off from KTH, which got acquired by Google. And of course, Google is a big US company. It's very complicated for them to participate in Swedish research projects. So we're actually right now reorganizing the project to do the same things, but without Forseti instead. And I think it's okay to say that these days. So what's the purpose? Okay, I think it's a well-known truth these days. So let me start with RecordedFuture. We're a threat intelligence company. We are actually, as we think now at least, the world's largest private company in the intelligence space. We're a Swedish-American company. We're headquartered in Boston from the start, have always been doing all our core R&D. So we're about 140 people in Gothenburg building the products and 1,000 people worldwide. And we started out doing geopolitical threat intelligence, but since about 10 years, we moved over to primarily do cyber. And of course, why we do that is that security for millennia has been built this way, including IT security. You take your valuable assets, you put a big wall around it, you try to make the wall as high and thick as possible, and then the security guys run around on the inside to see if someone has breached the wall or if there are bad guys on the inside. So the intelligence approach is, of course, instead to stand on the outside to see, are there people out there who are selling keys to my doors, or are there people selling property, IP or whatever, which comes from the inside clearly? Is there someone in a criminal forum who's asking for help in attacking a certain company? Happens all the time. So by having this external view, both of what your company looks like from the outside and what people are saying about you, you can actually have exactly the same view as the attackers. And I think this is the only way the defenders can actually be slightly ahead of the bad guys, or at least on par with them. So that's what we're doing. And the way we do this is that we surprisingly use the internet to capture information. So if you look at any typical cyber attack today, it leaves traces. Let's say it's a phishing attack. The first trace of that might be someone who registers a type of squat domain to prepare for a phishing attack. And then at some point, they actually register a certificate, and then that site goes live. And all this is information which we can trace. And then, of course, when something happens, you start people talking about maybe first on criminal forums, then on social media, then it hits mainstream news, and so on. So we take all this information and we gather it in our knowledge graph, which we call the intelligence graph, which is a decent-sized graph. It's a few 100 billion nodes and thousands of billions of connections between these entities. So if you think of the nodes in the graph, this will be all the IP addresses and domains in the world, a few tens of millions of companies, organizations, locations. So essentially, this maps up both the entities, the nouns in the world, if you like, and the ontology connecting them, but also the events. So you will have nodes in the graph corresponding to a documented attack. You'll know who was the attacker, who was the target, what methods did they use, and so on. So it's a nice asset. And really, we think of it as mapping three things. We map the bad guys, so we keep track of several hundred nation-state actors, thousands of criminal cyber groups of different kinds. We keep track of what tools they use, what infrastructure they own, known things they've been doing, and so forth. And then on the sort of the good side, we track today, I think it's about 600,000 companies where we have in details mapped from the outside what we can see of their infrastructure. So we know what domains and IP ranges they have, what tech stack they have, do they have an old version of web server running somewhere? And of course, everyone does. Leaked credentials being sold, and so on. And then we keep track of the rest of the internet as well. One good example of what we do is that for example, we have a current list of known command and control IPs. So any given day, we typically have between, let's say, 10 and 25,000 IP addresses, which are known command and control nodes. And we also gather network traffic, so we can actually track live attacks, finding the victims, because they are, of course, on the other side of the communication to one of those C2 nodes. So that's what we do. And then what Forseti and the research group at KTH is still doing is, of course, exactly what Simeon was talking about, doing attack simulations, modeling the systems, and then using probabilistic methods to try to decide how fast and in which way an attacker can get into a system. So it's very nice. You can build your little graph. You've all seen this in the previous talk. Thank you. And it's all great, except that this is a pretty static view of the world. So what we wanted to do in this project is to see how can we improve these simulations by adding real-time threat intelligence to the simulations. So essentially, today you have some kind of probability distribution saying, with some likelihoods, an attacker after a certain amount of time will have been able to access a part of the system, either the perimeter or some asset deep down in the system. But it's pretty manual, and it's, as I said, never up to date. So instead, we simply wanted to take this information and send it in to be able to do real-time simulations. And the data we're looking at, you could say, falls into 3 categories. The first is very basic things like, are there credentials or maybe AWS keys relevant to the system we're simulating, which are floating around. And actually, what's funny, the first thing we did, we took some example graphs, which Forseti had, and we looked at those in RecordedFuture, and we found a whole bunch of leaked AWS keys, for example, straight off. So, of course, the likelihood of someone being able to attack a system if they have the keys is pretty high. Similarly, we keep track of CVEs and vulnerabilities, and I think the important thing here is that we don't only have the list of that, we actually have also real-time data about which ones are, first of all, actually weaponized, so actually available in the wild. Also information like, do they require physical access or not? Of course, if it's a cloud-based system, if you don't have physical access, then the vulnerability might not be all that interesting. And the CVSS score and so on doesn't really give a good enough fine-grained view on how risky a CVE is, as we see it. And the third component is for any given company to look at the bigger pictures, given all those threat actors out there, and what they are interested in and what toolbox they have, how likely is it that they would actually be attacking me in particular? And I thought I would explore that a little bit further. So, so what we decided to do was to build a personalized threat map, as we call it. So essentially, for the several thousand threat actors we have, we wanted to build a view like this, where you could see for each threat actor and a specific company, what opportunity do they have? So the opportunity you can think of as the intersection of the toolbox of the bad guys and the weaknesses of the system under attack. And then the intent is based rather on what documented attacks has this actor been doing. Because if you look at it, I mean, these guys are, especially if you look at the criminal actors, they are pretty smart, they're pretty focused. They typically go after maybe a certain industry or a certain geography. Reason being that they want to be efficient. So if you built your phishing toolkit for going after banks in the Baltics, you want to go after every single bank in the Baltics. So this is the idea that you can take this, and of course, like in all charts like this, upper right corner is where you don't want to be. You want to focus your attention to the guys up there. So the way we do this is that we go into our graph. So we take, a very simplified picture here. We take a few attackers. We take a few of the documented targets in attacks. In the cases where they're actually customers of ours, we actually have their whole internal attack stack documented. Otherwise, we only might know about the perimeter surface of it. And then what we do is we augment the graph with information about which industry these guys are in, and which geography, and several other factors, but these are sort of the simple, intuitive examples. Similarly, we go on and augment the attackers, so we know for most of them which malware families they're using, their toolbox, so to speak. We know which vulnerabilities these are exploited, and of course, in many cases, we have a mapping from the vulnerability into the documented targets tech stack. And then we can abstract away from those concrete old targets and instead say that, okay, so now we have 3 attackers, these are their intents, and here are their opportunities, if you like. So when we then throw in a new company here to see how that would position itself on the map, essentially what we can do is we can see that in this particular case, these guys are active in an industry and in a geography which is relevant to attacker 1 here. Similarly for attacker 2 here, they're only relevant in the same geography, but they're not in the same industry. And attacker 3 here actually has no connection. There's no known intent, and there is no known capability. So what we do then is, let's see if this is much nicer animation when you don't have the organizers redoing of the slide transitions. Let me just flip to the end here. So essentially, you know, this is the thing we get. We can get a list for each of these, and then that transforms into the coordinate system, and we can map these guys onto the threat map like this. So this gives you a way to prioritize. And what you can then do is then you can go into a system like RecordedFuture and actually get the much more detailed information about a certain threat actor. This allows you now to see exactly which toolboxes they are known to have been using, which C2s are relevant here, which file hashes are related to the malwares they're using, and so on. And this we can then feed into the attack simulation, saying that these are the guys we think are most likely, here are the toolboxes, and given that, we can go in and modify the probabilities for the attack simulation. And I think that's pretty much it. So I think, you know, the bigger picture, we think that automation is key to building any modern security stack, and intelligence is necessary for that. So I think this project is a great example of how you can combine a few different technologies and actually give much, much more relevant real-time information. Thank you.